Molweni, good afternoon, and thank you so much for joining us. Igama lami Nwabisa Makunga, editor of the Sowetan, and today I'm really excited to be having this conversation. It's one of those in our country that its importance can never be overstated. We're talking land, and in particular, we are discussing this book, Land Matters. It is written by one of South Africa's best legal minds, Adv Tembeka Ngcukaitobi. Advocate, the last time you and I spoke in a conversation such as this, discussing another book, I remember you promised that this one was coming, and I was quite excited. And so when it came out, I think days after it came out, I basically jumped at the opportunity to say, let's have this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me. I think the last time, I don't know whether you were working for the EP Herald or you had some history with the Herald.
Correct. Yes, that's correct.
Excited to say that you've now gone on, hopefully, to bigger things.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. Thank you for joining us as well. And of course, we're joined by one of my faves, one of the best political analysts in the country, based in my hometown of Gqeberha in the Eastern Cape, a researcher and analyst and lecturer at the Mandela University, Mr. Ongama Mtimka. Ongs, how are you doing?
I'm well, thank you, Nab. It's great to be here. I think the best editor of any read in South Africa. Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here and also joining Advocate, who's really doing great things in the country, whether it be at WUSU, writing books, or out in the forays of law and, conquering giants there.
Thank you. So, guys, everybody has been really waiting for this conversation. So I'm going to kick it off. Advocate Ngcukaitobi, this book, I must say I actually enjoyed it. It's really excellent work. So you start us off, kind of on a historic journey. You take us through conquest, essentially during colonialism. You take us through apartheid, which you say was basically the legalization of conquest. And I just want to find out from you, and maybe you can just give us an overview of what it's about. But what is it about those periods that you're wanting to draw our attention to make us realize, or understand why we are here today and how it is relevant to how we live at this present moment?
Yes, no, thank you for that question. I think that one of the aims of the book is to try and expand the debate of land beyond the narrow expropriation without compensation discourse that has dominated South Africa for the past 3 years. But it is also to try and expand it beyond Section 25 itself and to try and locate it in a larger context. And what I'm trying to do with both the colonial, in fact, the book starts off really, the first date in the book is in the cattle chapter. It's 1647. And that's even before the decision by the Dutch East India Company to settle permanently in the Cape. The purpose of those historic sections, which is part 1 of the book, firstly, is to situate the debate in a larger historical trajectory. But why that is crucial is to trace the story of loss, to say that the story of loss that focuses on whether to expropriate a particular piece of ground at a particular time by a particular family is an incomplete story, and that we need to understand conquest in a larger historical sweep. So I'm tracing history for purposes of affirming recognition, existence, identity. But I'm also trying to trace the extent of the loss so that we can debate meaningfully about what ought to be returned. What exactly is it that was lost? So in those sections, you will find there was obviously a loss of land, but there was also a loss of cattle. There was also a loss of identity. There was a loss of culture. There was a loss of the economy. And the economy primarily was a cattle-based economy. So it is the constellation of the multiple forms of loss that you will find in the first section of the book.
And I think for me, what I did actually find interesting is some of the characters, you talk about, never mind who their names are, but it's really what their role had been in the project of colonialism. You speak, for example, of people like Theophilus Shepstone, and who I found was quite a, an interesting character. And just really the role, and perhaps you could take us through it, the role that he would have played in stripping off, the rights of African people, stripping off their land rights. Take us through that moment.
This is fascinating. Trapston is probably one of the most important agents of British colonialism in South Africa. Probably not the most important. I think that title belongs to Sir George Grey. Yeah. But he certainly is among the premier significant agents of British colonialism. We must first situate him in history, and that is the style I adopt in each chapter in the book. In the 1830s, a conflict arose in the Cape between the British and the Dutch, the Boers. The Boers left the Cape in what was referred to at the time the Great Track. One of the areas where they settled was Natal. Shortly after their settlement, they encountered an independent Zulu kingdom under King Dingane. A war broke out in 1838. Dingane was deposed, defeated in the Battle of Nome, 16 December 1838, Battle of Blood River. But Dingane was not killed in that year. He would be killed in the following year of 1839 through a combination of Boers and his half-brother Mbande. So from 1839, effectively, Natal came under the control of the Boers. In 1842, 3 years thereafter, the British became interested in Natal because of its strategic importance. They themselves declared it as an independent under the sphere of the British colony, and it reported directly to the Cape. Theophilus Shopton, who had grown in the Eastern Cape himself, particularly under the tutelage of Harry Smith, was one of the first bureaucrats called the diplomatic agent of native tribes. One of the first bureaucrats who was then deployed to run the nascent British administration from 1844. One of his projects, which he had tried in the Eastern Cape, but he left the Eastern Cape rather hurriedly because there was a risk that he would be killed, among others, by the people of King Pato. One of his initial projects was what was known as the Natal Locations Commission, by which he was trying to enforce what became known as indirect rule. In other words, the British would not send someone from England or from the Cape to run the natives. Rather, they would appoint one of the native chiefs to run and implement British policy in Natal. Sometimes a chief who did not toe the line would be deposed. Sometimes a completely new location would be established which did not exist, again administered and run by a colonially selected chief. Sometimes an existing legitimate hereditary chief would be told that he must now toe the line at the risk of conflict with the British. So on the one hand, one of the reasons why he is such a significant factor is the strategy of colonization that functioned along indirect rule through the establishment of native locations. But on the other, it is the introduction of a completely new land tenure policy. There were two ambiguities. On the one hand, it was the introduction of private property, which was a completely new concept among the Zulus. In fact, among the Africans across Southern Africa. But that had to be superimposed on a communal tenure. And then on the third hand, it was the complete reorganization of the legal institutions and the legal systems of the Africans by imposing a legal system that would then operate against a customary system. Customary system continues to function provided it is not repugnant with the super system, which was the legal system imposed by the British. And one of the reasons, this is the final point I make about Shepston, is that that model of colonial rule has been one of the most sustained and sustainable models. And it continues to feature in modern South Africa. Although the ANC purported during its entire life as a liberation organization to upend the colonial system, one of the ideas that stuck with it was this idea of private property. We have people like Shapston to thank for that.
I was actually going to ask you this. I mean, I was quite surprised, I must say, reading the book, and you talk about the idea of private ownership, and how it was essentially kind of a foreign idea, and how we've embraced it so much and sustained it so much, and how government, for example, our current government now, kind of upholds it as the holy grail, or the standard, golden standard of how to own land. I mean, is it such a bad thing though? I mean, we talk about how, if I own a title deed, for example, there is some idea or possibility of me or getting some sort of economic prosperity. Is it false, in a sense, or what do you think?
Well, that is the promise, isn't it, Nwabisa? That's the promise of the title deeds. One of its proponents is a Peruvian economist, Hernando de Soto, who wrote a book called The Mystery of Capital. And he said that in Peru, which is the country that he was investigating, and I think that in a number of South American states, a lot of capital or potential for wealth is hidden in informal and communal titles. And that the way to realize the value in that property is by registering title. So the same kind of informality and communalism that he was talking about in Peru is obviously present in the South African context. If you went to a township like Alex or a township anywhere in the country, what you find is many informal settlements, many people having to coexist and to share the spaces that they live in. The promise of private title then is that the only way to make it from what he called dead capital into active capital is that if you register it and you own a piece of paper, you can go to the bank and tell the bank that you now have a collateral. And the bank will use that collateral against which they would lend you cash. Yet in this country, researchers went to Joe Slovo in the early 2000s to test the model of De Soto, to find out if you subdivided an informal settlement and you gave it people a form of title, you told them that they were now the owners, they were no longer just tenants. Would the banks, in fact, lend you the cash? What they discovered was that actually banks work on income. What they want is that there must be money in your bank account. So for as long as you do not have a job, the mere fact that you have an informal settlement title in Alex is not a guarantee to financial prosperity. And yet another example in the context of the former Transkei area is large pieces of informal land, which could be made productive land, not by conversion into title, but by the banks changing their modality of lending. So the point is not to say we should destroy private property, but it is to say that we should recognize its limits as an instrument of land reform. Only in 2018, May and in October 2018, President Ramaphosa promised what he called Title Deeds Friday, that he would distribute 13,000 title deeds. He went there only once, he never came back the following week. I don't know if any title deeds were ever distributed. On that day, perhaps a few were distributed. But the idea that every one of us in the 58 million in number are one day going to wake up having title deeds against which we can go to the banks and ultimately secure our economic futures seems to be totally utopian. So we should problematize and question private property as to whether it inhibits land reform or not.
I actually want to come back to some of what you're saying, in particular, the point you make about what it promises as, versus essentially what our reality is on the ground, and in particular, when you look at the informal property sector. But I want to bring in Ongama at this point. And Ongama, I just want to get your thoughts about, what you thought of the book. I understand particularly you you really had some thoughts around the transition period and really kind of interrogating that. What was the promise of the transition period as far as land? And has the South African government, yes, we say it's failed, but what exactly is our constitution basically saying about that? Do you want to come in here?
Thank you, Nwabisa. So what I think I appreciated a lot about the book is the broad approach of in fact, I call it, after spotting a few of these things, the book of redemptions, in the sense that, one, I see there's a deliberate attempt by the senior counsel Ngcukaitobi to redeem our perceptions about the extent to which the Constitution is a document that can be used in order to advance land reform. So, for example, one of the things that states in the book is that the Constitution itself is, and in fact it's a continuation even from The Land is Ours, that the Constitution itself is revolutionary a document enough to allow for purposes of ensuring that there's just access to land. And then also what I found was that the chapter, especially that's dealing with what went wrong, while it recognizes the works that have been done by others insofar as showing the limitations, the problems of inefficiency in the distribution of land and resolution of land claims under the question whether restitution. It also raises critical questions around the questions of how the structure itself, the economics, the politics, as well as matters of procedure, I'm paraphrasing, how does the structure itself place limitations on the extent to which land reform can be accelerated? So while recognizing that there has been significant inefficiencies as far as the state as processes are concerned, as well as rampant corruption in the process, which corruption has ranged from private actors, be they owners of land or claimants, or in fact officials of the department, it recognizes that it's not the complete picture, and brings in this element of the structure itself, the design of how the process of claims gets to be championed, and its centrality on the commission and the state, how that is disempowering, but also the choice of the date, the year 1913, as a limiting factor. And I think you've already delved into the role of Shepstone and Pine. I think for me, I got to ask myself as I stumbled upon those names, Nwabi, as to why do we still have these towns named after, why do we still Pine Town and Port Shepstone? Especially also how the advocate, again, in this book of redemptions thesis that I'm advancing, the idea of, well, for lack of a better word now, I think tribal claims to land or collective claims, and how he advances this notion that that is not, as problematic as it may be, it is not necessarily something to be frowned upon, but to be embraced, especially where it was recognized that in certain instances, the corrective action or measure may not necessarily be resettlement, but some spiritual, cultural, and related, reclamation of that land. So in broad terms, I like the fact that the book is redeeming. To go back to your question, in my view, it redeems our perceptions about the transition period and the role of the ANC as far as Section 25 is, as far as Section 25 is concerned, while at the same time it chastises the political establishment about how it has failed to make use of the instruments that are already available in law to be able to advance a much faster land reform. So far, those are the things.
Advocate Ongama says you are affirming our current constitution in its current form as a revolutionary document.
Yeah.
And while that is so, I also know that you talk about some limitations in law. So corruption aside, and we'll come back to that later, but you do talk about some limitations in law. Do you want to help us explore what those limitations are, in particular to how we live at the moment?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, look, of course, Ongama is right, and I like his phraseology, redemptive. It's clear that he's an academic. Redemptive ethos of the book. And I mean, let's break this thing down. So we just go back to 1993, perhaps 1992, is a big debate. On the one hand are the liberation forces led by the ANC. On the other hand are the forces of the establishment led by the National Party. And they have a most articulate spokesperson and a very learned one in the form of Sheila Cameron. The big debate is what to do about the land question. And in the book, I begin to discuss the comparative examples, the land question in Zimbabwe, the land question in Namibia, because they are our immediate neighbors. The starting point, both in Namibia and in Zimbabwe in Lancaster, 1979, Namibia in Windhoek, 1989. The starting point was that white people would retain what they had acquired under colonialism and what they had acquired in Namibia under apartheid. And that was always the starting point. And what we would then create would be a framework which would entitle the new post-colonial state to begin a process of redistribution. We follow exactly the same model. Is that you start off by the recognition that what has been acquired would remain, but the new state would have the authority and the power to redistribute what has been acquired. What are these redemptive features of the Constitution? One big debating point during the transition was whether or not there should be private property at all, the entitlement or the right to private property. The Constitution does not have the right to private property. The ANC won the debate, hands down. The second point was whether or not you should even have the concept of expropriation subject to anything below market value. The Constitution, again, recognizes the right of expropriation. And the third debating point was whether or not you should have the right to restitution in relation to those people that lost rights in land after 1913 and under the Group Areas Act and throughout the apartheid era. Again, the ANC won that. So on the three contentious areas, the ANC won. It was in fact an ANC document produced in 1991, which also superimposed a judicial system to check whether or not the procedures followed by the state were lawful or not. And again, the ANC won that debate in its entirety. In fact, even the judiciary at the time, Chief Justice Corbett, wrote a very critical paper in which he opposed the proposals of the ANC, which nevertheless carried the day. So insofar as that redemptive element of the constitutional project, it's clear that the constitutional project has always been part and parcel of the struggle against colonialism. That's the theme of the land is ours. But even in the transition, those ideas of the ANC were carried throughout. But as Ongama correctly points out, it's not enough in our critique to complain about the inefficiencies of government or to complain about corruption. We've got to look at the structural limitations. What does that mean in practice? In 1996, a new constitution is adopted, but that is the same year as the adoption of GEAR, a macroeconomic strategy, which in its character is a market-based approach to the economy. But in the year thereafter, specifically talking about land, the ANC government adopts its white paper on land reform. It specifically inscribes willing seller, willing buyer. So a year earlier, it won the debate on willing seller, willing buyer, that it would not be a constitutional principle. And then a year thereafter, it superimposes and economic policy. So from the get-go, the potential of transformation under the Constitution is constrained by an overarching macroeconomic framework that is constraining in its very character. So that's structural problem number one. Structural problem number two is this design of land reform, particularly on the restitution front, works against the interests of the landless. If you look at how, in fact, the process ought to work, it is primarily driven by the state through the commission, and it is driven by the state through the judicial process. So that kind of bureaucratization and judicialization of land reform, in a sense, works against the interests of the poor. In other words, claimants become spectators in the process of land reform. And I've seen how disempowering that is. They depend on an attorney, on an advocate, on a land valuer, on a sometimes a historian, sometimes an accountant. But they depend on all of these professionals to speak on their behalf, and the space for them to say their say. And I even make a comparison here with the TRC process, where you confronted the victim and the victimized. They sat across the table, and you confronted the person who did something wrong to you directly. But in the land reform process, all of that is mediated by the state. But there's a third constraining feature of it, the compensation element. Unlike what happened under the TRC model, there is no recompense that is conducted by the perpetrators. Instead, the recompense is a collective effort by us. So in other words, people have inherited pieces of ground, theoretically, under illegitimate circumstances. But the model of compensation is a collective model. So that burden and pain of colonialism is now redistributed across and is shared by all of us. And that payment is primarily driven by the state itself. So if you had inherited illegitimately private property, you never have to confront the pain that your forefathers may have caused to the family that lost the pieces of ground. You actually never even have to see them. And you get the cash regardless. And that cash comes to you from the state. So those are the structural limitations that we should not gloss over when we embrace the success of the constitutional project.
So how do we unburden the landless, as you say, from really, having to go through or having to depend on other people to speak for them? How do we cut the middleman, so to speak?
Yeah, I watched the other. All right. So to answer you directly on the book, the book on that section is a critique of how disempowering the framework of land reform is, and how it ultimately reduces the landless into spectators in the process that is intended to empower them. So this empowerment is designed to be, a gift. It's like a house, like the whole RDP project. I'll give you a house, but you don't have to have any say about the size or the color or the windows or the doors. You just take it, and that's been the model of the ANC government throughout. It's this idea of delivery to a recipient that is sitting and waiting at home. And the land reform program fits precisely in that mold. So it is a critique. There are other models which are not the same as this model. I spoke about this model of the TRC, where there is in fact a confrontation, right? Where there is an unburdening, which in many respects is therapeutic, So that's the one model that we miss that opportunity. It's probably come and gone. But there is also another one of simply cutting out the lawyers and simply putting the judicial system and having the claimants speak directly to their own causes and not having to depend on an overly judicialized process. There is also another model of a mediated outcome. But the big point is to make the victims of the dispossession central in the ways in which their particular stories are resolved. In the book, I talk about how the victims of the Holocaust were in fact driving the reparations movement and not sitting back and waiting for someone else to give them, in a sense, a gift.
Ongama, one of the I think interesting points that the advocate brings out in the book is the idea of regulating the informal property sector. And the question I really want to pose to you, I'll come for him to explain it, but the question I want to come to you is, the urgent need, perhaps, that we have to deal with informal property sector. There are shacks, coming out of everywhere. We've got people who are renting back rooms, and that's really kind of essentially the way of life for many, many South Africans. He then also talks about the fact that we need to, in whatever the regulation framework we must have, we then need to consider also economic migrants who come into the country. So the question I want to ask to you, Ongama, is really how you think, that in itself is even possible, but also in how it could potentially, or if it's a way to potentially calm down what is essentially social disorder, that we see, and social uprising that we see in many of our communities.
Sure, very interesting one, Nwabisa. So if you think about it, the approach that is being used when it comes to settlement of land in urban centers, part of it has got to do with the legacies of unplanned settlement of land in urban centers or peri-urban centers for Black people. And the pattern in which that unfolds is that there are no geotechnical assessments which get to be done, especially in the recent period. Obviously, that's been a historic phenomenon of how a Black settlement of land in urban centers was not planned, precisely because of the legacies of influx control and needing to keep the Black population mainly in the homelands and therefore not established in urban centers. So what has happened is that the approach that is used is almost similar to how, in fact, it's far less than how land is accessed in the rural areas, where you find that you are going to speak to his border and get a piece of land cut for you. So what happens in municipalities...
That is incomplete. You don't only speak to his border, you also leave a bottle of something.
True that.
Absolutely. And so that how land is occupied and settled carries almost similar patterns. So part of the problem, the municipalities were dealing with this, I think, leading up to, for example, the beginning of the 2010s. There was a very structured approach of dealing decisively with land invasions, using Metro Police and another. Obviously, it was chaotic and it has disastrous political consequences. But part of what changed post 2014-16, and in fact, since the rise of the ANC Youth League's economic freedom in our lifetime rhetoric, which was partly good politicking in order to foreground the issue of land and inequity in access to land, was the fact that municipalities, especially after 2016, the major metropolitan municipalities, needed, as a result of the political environment of coalitions, needed, especially if you look at Joburg and Nelson Mandela Bay, precisely because the executive heads, the executive mayors, needed the support of particularly the EFF. Part of the trading was that municipalities must have lax rules about that. And then you come to Nelson Mandela Bay. Part of the internal politics of the ANC was the chaotic opening up and creation of false justice and false redress by encouraging people to invade land. My view is that there, and unfortunately I've missed what the advocates' guide on this is, but my view has been that there's a way in which we could learn something about how equitable, in relative terms, is the non-market-based approach that's being used in rural areas. And there is a way in which we should take lessons from there and apply it. It's being done with RDP, and I think there are greater avenues for doing that. The dismissive approach, so neither is the EFF's approach, which encourages invasion of land, because sometimes people invade land that is under a dangerous power lines. But nor is the market-centric approach that says you can't have land in urban centers unless you have bought it or unless you've been a recipient of RDP housing, which is happening at a very slow pace compared to the rate at which urbanization is happening.
Advocate, do you agree? Do you think that there's something for us to learn, in particular how land is dealt with in rural areas, for example, versus urban areas? A lot of people will talk about, just spatiality, how the limitations of spatiality, etc. How do we navigate that?
Yes, I think the big point I make on that section on tenure is the interrogation of informal tenure, which is not mediated by law and commerce, which are the two instruments that mediate formal tenure, leases, and freehold. And every other form would then be subject to power and money. And those people who actually want to occupy land, they have to organize themselves into a group. And the way that group operates is by the assertion of power and authority. So the point is to insert a justice-based legal framework to mediate those relations, particularly because added to the conflict, which is largely a conflict over resources, added to that conflict is now the question of citizenship, where people from outside the country are also looking for the same economic opportunities. But that relationship is largely left to be regulated by political power, regulated by social power, and regulated by money. You cannot build a sustainable future on that basis. Why is this so? One reason is what Ongama says, which is that these are political trade-offs, deliberate political trade-offs. But there is also another deeper problem, which is that the ANC throughout still occupies this ambivalent role in society. One as liberator, the other as government. It is in fact ANC politicians who turn a blind eye on land settlement, and they ask, where do you think our people are going to get the land from? And at that point, they are occupying the role of destruction on the basis of liberation politics. But on the other hand, their primary responsibility under the law is as government, which imposes on them the duty of forward planning. So the big message on the informality and the ways in which power and money control those relations as opposed to law and commerce. The big point in land matters is that if tenure matters to the government, then it should be regulated. At the moment, the unregulated system of tenure creates an environment in which we have seen there is combustion all the time and there is instability all the time. So the point is tenure matters.
So I think there are a lot of questions kind of coming in via our chat, but I think it would be probably irresponsible of me not to ask you this question. I mean, you talk about tenure, and the big word I suppose I want to ask you about is banks. You write you write quite convincingly, in my view, about banks. And let me just ask this question. A lot of people, there's an understanding in South Africa, or a narrative in South Africa that says, if there is land, expropriation of land without compensation, the banking sector will collapse. Would it collapse?
No, the short answer is no. The argument by banks that there would be a catastrophic failure is a vastly exaggerated argument, not based on any scientific studies. I've done the numbers in the chapter around the exposure. If the expropriation without compensation focused as the intention is on agricultural land, what is the overall exposure of the collective exposure of the banks? And I then came to the conclusion that even if each and every piece of agricultural land was expropriated without compensation, the banking system would continue to run normally. But The problem with the debate is that it is the ripple effect. It is the signal that it is possible one day to have a loan and tomorrow that value to be written off. And this is the point I try to make. When it comes to the banks themselves, the banks have not put an argument that explains how a targeted, justice-based expropriation without compensation that focuses on particular classes of property, how that system would undermine confidence in the banking industry. That's point number one. Point number two, banking as an entitlement of each and every South African in this country has become so ubiquitous and so entrenched. None of us can live any meaningful lives without a bank account. Whether or not you are a social grant recipient or you are a captain of industry, every one of us, 58 million of us, we need a bank account. So the extent to which banking has become significant in our social lives has transformed banking into what I call banking is now a human right. Yet, banks are largely unregulated and have no social responsibilities to us as individuals. They control this power over our lives. If your bank account is closed tomorrow, your life comes to a standstill, which is not the same thing as if water were to be closed, because you could take money and go and buy an alternative supply of water. And again, which is not the same thing as if your electricity were to be cut off, because you could take money and go and get yourself a generator as an alternative to an electricity supply. And yet we impose so much regulation to electricity providers, ESCOM, or to water providers in the municipality. Yet we do not impose the same or similar obligations on banks. So the point I make is, it is impossible to treat banks as an island, given the ubiquity of banking in our personal lives. I'm not talking the economy, I'm just talking on an individual basis. It is impossible to see banks as an island. So the big message I put there on the banks is that it is time for the banks to recognize that they too owe social obligations for the redress in this country. Some of them, in fact, were established under the ashes of slavery, under the ashes of the colonial system. So it is time for us to have a paradigm shift that recognizes that because banks are so central and because historically they themselves were part and parcel of the beneficiaries of the system, they too have an obligation to help us with the redress and to help us with the recognition of the constitutional goals.
And I do think, I mean, you argue quite well in the book. I think that the resistance, perhaps, there is no business case for the resistance, or provable business case for the resistance. I'm going to take a lot of questions coming through, and guys, I'll try and read as many as possible. I may not be able to take all of them, and I'd like this particular question to pose both to Ongama and the advocate, and it is really questioning our farming skills. So it says perhaps a lack of farming skills among Africans, and I knew you'd laugh at that. And a lack of funding tends to be the biggest problems that leads to failures in land reform. Do you agree? Ongama, do you want to take this one first?
Sure. So there's a tendency to treat African skills in the same way and tendency to generalize. Fact of the matter is that who's working in commercial farms are vastly Africans. If you also look at some of the resilient ways of farming lands, you will find that we have lots of that at the level of the community. One of the problems with land reform for me is the tendency to distribute access to opportunities, be they for farming or anything else, on the basis of political connections, rather than genuinely on the basis of who wants to farm, who has been doing it, because not everybody has, followed the trend of urbanizing and wants to live an urban life. We have residual skills within the African population. But obviously, it's true to some degree that social capital, or some of the skills you gain by social capital and exposure. Being exposed to running a business, because it's not the same, harvesting or plowing fields is not the same as running a commercially sensitive operation. Neither it does lack of the latter skill. Neither should it imply that people do not get access to those opportunities. It's been done throughout the development finance sector, where you, especially of the state, where you find that farmers are assisted by mentors that get assigned to every successful applicant who shows a genuine commitment to farming. But the challenge is that when a system becomes neo-patrimonial, it tends to allocate opportunities for things on the basis of kinship and friendship. And I think that we have a bigger problem there rather than a problem of lack of skills among the Black population to be able to exploit opportunities availed by creating access to land and big commercial farms.
Advocate, bathi asinawufumana umhlaba ngoba sinaso isakhono sawo.
Yeah, you know, sometimes, honestly, you know, all right, so the government has two programs by which you can acquire land if you don't buy it in the open market. One program is called restitution. Now that program has nothing to do with whether you can farm or not. It simply has everything to do with whether or not you were dispossessed of land after the 19th of June, 1913. If you can prove that your forefathers or foremothers or forebears were dispossessed, you claim your land to get it back. Nobody puts you through a means test. There is a second program, which is what a lot of people focus on, which is the redistribution program. Now, it works through a form of a land acquisition strategy. The government buys lots of farms, and it warehouses these farms, and then people then apply for the right to use those farms. And the model works on the basis of a leasehold. What happens is that you get a lease. The lease says you can buy the farm in the first 5 years if you wish to exercise that option. Alternatively, you can stay on the farm for 30 years. Some of these deals are very lucrative to the new elite, farming elite, because I saw one contract, which is 300 hectares for a rental of 67,000 rands per annum, which is roughly 6,000 rands a month. But for 300 hectares, that's like a massive piece of ground. Now, the problem, of course, is in those allocations, and this is what Ongama calls neo-patrimonial. In those allocations, there is no means test that the government applies. What happens, it is a totally opaque and a random system. So we don't actually know who gets them and for what reason. And one of the suggestions I have made is that we need a public list of everyone who is a tenant in a state-owned farm for 30 years, paying off 6,000 rands a month and using vast sums of land. So we need transparency. The second problem is that because there is no means test that is applied, the people who get allocated are not tested for their farming skills. But, Nwabisa, it is ridiculous to say Black people cannot farm. It is utterly ridiculous. Black people have been farming for generations in this country. They are still farming in the Cape, in the vineyards, massive production. In Limpopo, in the citrus farms, massive production. In the Eastern Cape, anyone who goes to a farm, you will not be greeted by a white man at the gate. You'll be greeted by a Black person.
So I've got, actually, that is very true. I think that is really like the lay of the land in South Africa. I've got another question where someone is asking, you know, or making perhaps a comment saying, when talking about unplanned settlements in rural areas, there's a serious challenge where chiefs are abusing their power and their status. And I think we've seen quite a large sort of ripple effect of that. It's really that again, that's stripping away of people's rights. Any comment from you guys about the abuse of power by, particularly in communal lands or in rural areas, by people who hold traditional power?
So maybe before Advocate comes, because I want to pick something from his book here. It was so again, this is in the theme of Book of Redemptions. Two things for me. It was so great to learn that part of the power that is said to arise from customary or traditional law is in fact an emergent phenomenon from the distortion of linked to Shepstein, among others. So it was quite great to see that, and in fact, it made me understand why in my own village, the development of in fact, yeah, the political geography of the Eastern Cape was the closer you get to KZN, the more rigid that power is, as well as also in areas like Umtata. But if you come across the Khai towards our areas, what I've seen is that the extent to which that power of traditional chiefs is entrenched is actually not even there. So it was good to see that part of what is claimed to be customary is in fact a bastardized claim. And also I liked the approach on how even in terms of attitudes to women ownership of land, that too is part of the distortions of colonialism. The idea is that women could not actually hold title.
So is there a way that communities can be empowered, or at least their power back?
No, yeah, I'm sorry, Nabi. Ongama has raised this, is fascinating. So I just need to go back to a point of history again. One of the Shepstonian notions of African custom, and you can see Shepton was constructing this, between 1846 right up to the 1870s. So he had more than 30 years of constructing this idea. In 1873, Cetrayo was enthroned as a king of the Zulus after the death of Mbande. Shepstone attended the enthronement, but he came as Shag. Now, the reason he did so is because part of the idea of Shepstone, and it comes from a book by Caroline Hamilton called Terrific Majesty. Part of the Shepstonian concept was to reconstruct the image of Shag, the despot, and then to assemble power around himself through the image of Shag as a despotic ruler, the concentration of that power. No wonder, after 1879, one of the very first statutes in KZN, the Native Administration Act, we subsequently got it for the whole country in 1927. But it started in KZN, which imposed from top Shepstone himself or whoever became the Governor General as a Supreme Chief of all natives. Thereafter, a devolution of despotism, which was a construction in service of the ways of imposing British and colonial rule. Fascinatingly, that became the code of Zulu law. It became customary law. But the entire thing of the tribal system was imposed top to bottom. It existed right up to, I think the code was abolished only in 1987. That system became embedded in the social, political, religious mores of the people. And they began to see themselves in reference to that model and began to embrace it. For men, it gave them superpowers that they never previously held, particularly over the control of women's bodies. Women had in fact started becoming much more liberated and started working in the farms themselves. But the Shepton model brought them back 20, 30 years before, and then introduced this system. So today we call this customary law, but as Ongama says, it is bastardized. In the book, I call it the distorted version of customary law. It obviously is not consistent across. In my own village, just like in Ongama's village, in fact, we never even had a chief. In another village, which is not far from where I come from, they always elected their headman. And yet the customary version that we have become accustomed to tells us of primogeniture. Somebody is born into chieftaincy as a universal principle of all African societies across, but it never in fact was the case. So what I propose on this topic, firstly, is confronting the point of empire, because that is one of the modes of decolonization, is going back to the point of contact. So confronting the point of empire helps us to rethink the ways of the colony that continue in many unstated ways, in a sense, as common sense. So the power that the chiefs have is not common sense, is not customary. It has nothing to do with hereditary powers. It's constructed. And so by looking at how it was constructed, we can be liberated from it. So people can stop telling us that we are distorting or fighting against the custom. They can actually realize we're going back to through custom. In fact, through custom was always bottom-up, democratic. It had many patriarchal tendencies that we still need to purge our system of, but they were rarefied and amplified by the colonial project. So this is the big message, is going back to the point of contact as a mechanism for decolonization.
I honestly, when I read that chapter in particular, I thought to myself, you probably owe us an entire book on that going forward. So I want to make a proposal to say, going forward, I think you ought, because it was actually quite fascinating. We are fast running out of time, but I really do think that there are two questions that I want to ask. Masitole Zinto is asking, and pretty straightforward, advocate, if you can take it. He says, if I buy a farm now using the bank money and my farm is expropriated next year, who's going to pay back the bank?
Yes, that's one of the topics I try and deal with, that risk ought to be shared between the buyer, the bank, and the state.
And Ongama, is there anything you want to say about that? I suppose in the sense that
I'll pass on that one.
Around it.
Yeah.
And the very last question I want to ask is from Jeremiah Klaas, who's asking, why is there no regard placed on land that has property development value in areas of malls, apartments, etc.? I'll repeat the question. Why is there no regard placed to land that has property development value in the event of malls or apartments or warehouses?
I would have imagined that there is. And in fact, that's part and parcel of the critique, is that we've got a highly commercialized, highly market-based, urban-based focus to land.
Essentially, it is actually probably the bias rather than not. My personal very last question is, and I know, advocate, you this is not your favorite question, but is the expropriation of land without compensation the final answer to our historic land question?
Can I pass that to Ongama?
I'll let Ongama start. Ongama, you can take that one, but I'm not going to let it go. It may not be a yes or a no, but Ongama, you can go ahead.
So in my book, sorry, in the advocate's book, Nwabi, one thing I've seen is the merge, the bringing together of the national question of South Africa belonging to all who live in it, without the denialism that white political organizations have had. And I think that it goes together with what advocate says we miss, not only in relation to dispossession, but also in terms of the economy in general. If you take his answer to you on the banking question. So the issue here is that there has got to be a degree to which beneficiaries of colonialism and apartheid recognize the inherent privilege that has come as a result of a very direct bequeathing from the policies of the past. And therefore, only that is going to unleash a greater commitment to want to work together. So expropriation may not necessarily solve all the problems, because it only deals with the supply side. And as we have seen, as far as advocates' book is concerned, we have more of structural problems around distribution too, not just supply side. But it's an important instrument in as far as, for me, also helping the state gain access to much needed land for redress purposes.
Yeah.
So, Advocate, how do we broaden the conversation then beyond looking at expropriation without compensation as perhaps the narrow answer to the problem?
Yes, I mean, let me first agree with Ongama on the point, because I think he makes the one critical point, which is that the big message, I mean, in other words, we should see expropriation without compensation as a proxy debate and not as a narrow debate. So if it is a proxy debate for a much larger unresolved structural question, in other words, the postponed question of the liberation, when are we going to get our land back? So if that is what expropriation without compensation means or represents, then of course it is a meaningful debate. But if expropriation without compensation means the removal of the compensation provisions to Section 25 of the Constitution, then of course it is a pointless conversation, because removing it or having it actually makes no difference. So broadening the conversation so that expropriation without compensation is proxy for the resolution of the unresolved land question, in terms of which we ask the uncomfortable question of the transition, which is, given that we've accumulated all this wealth, and that accumulation has been at the expense of Black people, including by the dispossession of their cattle, how in fact are we going to create an equitable future together, not to punish you, but an equitable future, so that South Africa truly belongs to all who live in it, which is a promise that all of us have signed up to. Then, of course, we are having an important conversation that we have postponed in the country. One of the things practically which we have to do on the redistribution side, in fact, including on the supply side of land, is that the entire land reform project, the entire value chain, I have got a chapter that traces the entire value chain of land. Landowners decide which land becomes available. Mm-hmm. Landowners set the price. Landowners decide who gets the land. Landowners even decide what happens after the settlement. So that control of the land reform, which is embedded in the structure, which I critique, so that control of the land reform projects in the hands exclusively of landowners has to be dismantled if you are going to have a new form of land redistribution, in terms of which the landless and the state that they have elected democratically can have a meaningful say.
Advocate Ngcukaitobi, author of the book Land Matters. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for sharing your insights. Ongama Mtimka, lecturer at the Mandela University. Thank you so much for joining us. Unfortunately, we'll run out of time for this conversation, but do look forward to more conversation on Sowetan Live. Subscribe to us, www.sowetanlive.co.za. To find out where to buy this book, you can also click on Sowetan Live on the link, this particular link, or the link where the story of this conversation will be uploaded. I look forward to having more conversations with you. Thank you very much for joining us. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.
Thank you.